We'll share the screen. Here we go. So this is Miketz. Miketz is the name of the parsha. It means at the end of a 2-year period after Joseph interpreted the earlier dreams at the end of last week's portion. So we read Joseph's imprisonment finally ends when Pharaoh's dreams of 7 fat cows that are swallowed up by 7 lean cows, and of 7 fat ears of grain swallowed by 7 lean ears. Joseph interprets the dreams to mean that 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of hunger, and advises Pharaoh to store grain during the plentiful years. Pharaoh appoints Joseph governor of Egypt. Joseph marries Asnat, daughter of Potiphar, and they have 2 sons, Menashe and Ephraim. Famine spreads throughout the region, and food can be obtained only in Egypt. 10 of Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to purchase grain. The youngest, Benjamin, stays home, for Jacob fears for his safety. Remember that Jacob has 4 wives, but his most beloved wife, Rachel, who died young, had 2 sons. Joseph, who was gone missing, and now Benjamin. So Jacob wants to keep Benjamin close to home. In any case, Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they do not recognize him. He accuses them of being spies, insists that they bring Benjamin to prove that they are who they say they are, and imprisons Simon as a hostage. Later, they discover that the money they paid for their provisions has been mysteriously returned to them. He agrees to send Benjamin only after Judah assumes personal and eternal responsibility for him. This time, Joseph receives them kindly, releases Simon, and invites them to an eventful dinner at his home. But then he plants his silver goblets, purportedly imbued with magic powers, in Benjamin's sack. When the brothers set out for home the next morning, they are pursued, searched, and arrested. When the goblet is discovered, Joseph offers to set them free and retain only Benjamin as a slave. They come back and they say, no, we're all going to be slaves. And they're heading back to Egypt. And that's where we leave off. This story is the greatest cliffhanger in the Torah. If you want to really know what happened, you have to come back next week. That's how we make sure people come back to shul the next week. Okay, so that's the dreams. We'll have to open and read the dreams inside and see if, in fact, what Joseph said was so brilliant, because one of the problems in the story, and everybody has to deal with it from one perspective or another, and we discussed this in the past, we'll mention some of the ideas we mentioned in the past today. Hopefully we'll add something new as well. But the question becomes, what is the big deal to come up with Joseph's interpretation? Joseph's interpretation, any novice dream interpreter would figure it out. And in Egypt, there's this whole industry of dream interpretations. And as you will see, Pharaoh himself calls all his interpreters, and nobody can figure it out. And Joseph, because it was so brilliant what he said, that he actually gets the job. And they say, okay, you're so brilliant, you're going to get the job of running the Egyptian economy, becoming the second in command. And the question is it really so difficult to come up with Joseph's dreams? With Joseph's interpretation? I mean, I think that if you were living in Egypt and they asked you to interpret the dreams, I'm not sure you would come up with an interpretation that was so different. So that is a window to analysis and try to figure out what was so impressive about Joseph's interpretation, and what was so why could nobody else figure it out, and why were they so impressed with Joseph's interpretation? Why was the Pharaoh so impressed to the extent that he says, okay, you got the job? Now, the Torah, we have the text, Genesis chapter 41. The Torah goes into great description about the dreams, and it tells us the dreams as they happen. And it also tells us the dreams, how Pharaoh tells the dreams to Joseph. So it's written at great length. So let's read a few verses. Let's see what happens. It came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh was dreaming, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And behold, from the Nile were coming up 7 cows of handsome appearance and robust flesh, and they pastured on the marsh in the marshlands. And behold, 7 other cows were coming up after them from the Nile, of ugly appearance and of lean of flesh. And they stood beside the cows which were on the Nile bank. So you have 7 fat cows, 7 lean cows standing together. Verse 4, and the cows of ugly appearance and lean of flesh devoured the 7 cows that were of handsome appearance and healthy. Then Pharaoh awoke. Pharaoh could not, he awoke, he has this dream where the skinny cows, the lean cows devour the fat cows, the healthy cows of handsome appearance. He wakes up, falls back asleep, Vayishan, and he fell asleep and dreamt again. And behold, 7 ears of grain were growing on one stalk, healthy and good. And behold, 7 ears of grain, thin and beaten by the east wind, were growing up after them. Same pattern, seven ears of grain that were healthy. And then there's 7 ears of grain that are beaten by the wind. Verse 7, and the thin ears of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy and full ears of grain. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, a dream. He has this twice. Now it came to pass in the morning, and his spirit was troubled. So he sent and called all the necromancers of Egypt and all its sages. And Pharaoh related to them his dream, but no one interpreted them for Pharaoh. Now this is a very interesting subtlety. No one interpreted them for Pharaoh. Says Rashi, it doesn't mean they didn't offer interpretations. Could have just said, if it means that they had no interpretation, it would have said, no one interpreted it. But instead, the verse says, no one interpreted them for Pharaoh. So let's see Rashi. How does Rashi address this nuance? Says Rashi, but no one interpreted them for Pharaoh. They did interpret them, but not for Pharaoh. For their voice did not reach his ears, and he had no satisfaction from their interpretation. And Rashi quotes a sample interpretation that Pharaoh's ministers would offer. For they said, you will beget 7 daughters, and you will bury 7 daughters. That's how they interpreted 7 fat cows, 7 healthy cows, and 7 daughters who will survive. And then you have 7 daughters who will die. I guess if you're the Pharaoh, you have many wives, you can have many children, and so this can work. But Pharaoh is not happy with this. It doesn't resonate. It doesn't resonate with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh therefore doesn't know what to do, and he is troubled, and that leads to the rise of Joseph, because as we see in the future verses, the minister who Joseph interpreted his dreams in last parsha steps forward and says, there's a boy who can interpret. They bring Joseph, and he interprets the dreams, as we said. Okay, so what's so difficult about this interpretation? Remember, we're dealing with an agriculture society, and Egypt, there's no rain in Egypt. They live off the Nile. So fat cows emerging from the Nile means that the cows are able to graze. There's food. If they're fat, there's food. Lean cows means there's no food. The lean cows swallowing the fat cows, everything is fine. 7 years of famine, 7 years. It's 7 years of plenty is the fat cows, 7 years of famine is the lean cows. It's a very simple interpretation. And when you talk about the interpretation of the second dream, which is ears of grain, I mean, could it be more obvious? It's so obvious. You're going to have good, healthy grain and unhealthy grain. Unhealthy grain is a year of famine. So what's the big deal? So Jill's raising her hand. I think Jill would personally, I think Jill would be able to come up with the interpretation that Joseph came up with. But go ahead, Jill, go ahead.
Rabbi, it just that the people had experienced before years of plenty followed by years of famine. So this was it would not have been an alien interpretation to them. But I'm just thinking that Joseph would have come up not just with the metaphor, but with the solution, and that was why Pharaoh heard him, because okay, that's it.
So Jill is alluding to is, I'm going to open up the verse. I'm going to open up the verses here. I'm going to hide Rashi's commentary. We'll go to the second reading. if you read Joseph's interpretation, you read as follows. So Pharaoh tells Joseph the whole story. So let's read what Joseph tells Pharaoh. So this is what chapter 41, verse 25. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dream is one. What God is doing, he had told Pharaoh. 7 good cows are 7 years, and 7 good ears of grain are 7 years. It is one dream. 7 meager and ugly cows coming up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears of grain beaten by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. And now he explains, it is this matter that I have spoken to Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he has shown Pharaoh. Behold, 7 years are coming, great plenty throughout all of Egypt, all the land of Egypt. And 7 years of famine will arise after them. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine will destroy the land. And the plenty will not be known because of the famine to follow it, for it will be very severe. And concerning the repetition of the dream to Pharaoh twice, that is because the matter is ready to emanate from God, and God is hastening to execute it. So now, let Pharaoh seek out an understanding and wise man and appoint him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and appoint officials over the land and prepare the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty. And let them collect all the food of these coming 7 good years, and let them gather the grain under Pharaoh's hand, food in the cities, and keep it. Thus the food will remain as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which will be in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not be destroyed by famine. The matter pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. So Pharaoh said to his servants, will we find anyone like this, a man whom there is the Spirit of God? And the next verse, they say, okay, we're going to appoint you, we're going to give you the job. So Jill is saying something interesting. Jill is telling us that what Pharaoh was impressed was not so much with the interpretation of the dream per se, but Pharaoh is impressed that finally somebody comes with a solution. And if there's a problem and everybody else is paralyzed, and you come forth and you have a vision and you have a solution, so the Pharaoh is going to say, wow, you're the guy with the solution, here are the keys. So that's Jill's point, very good point. Maybe I could add a little bit to it later, but that's certainly a good interpretation. But that interpretation also begs another interpretation, and that is from Joseph's perspective. Joseph was not hired to give public policy of what to do about years of famine, right? What is Joseph was hired to do? Interpret the dreams. So interpret the dreams, and that's it. Who asked you to give advice? You were not hired. You were a slave. You just came out of prison. You were not hired to give advice. You're hired to interpret the dream. So why is Joseph offering the interpretation? I'm sorry, the interpretation we know. Why is he offering the advice? And I'm just going to add that if you came to Pharaoh and you say, look, if the Pharaoh's economists come to Pharaoh and say, look, we're going to have 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, right? Isn't that an obvious solution? So save some grain for the years of famine. So in other words, even Joseph's advice is not that earth-shattering. So what I'm trying to figure out, and many commentators are trying to figure out, is what is it? It has to be that what Joseph says is so revolutionary and so earth-shattering that Pharaoh is impressed. And of course, before we leave, we also have to figure out what is the implication of all this in our life, because we're not just sitting in to figure out what happened in the storyline and the simple plot. We also want to figure out what is the relevance to us. So Joseph's advice to us has to be so earth-shattering that we'll say, wow, Joseph, you're right, here are the keys, and this is how we should run our life. So we have to read the story on multiple levels. Okay, but Jill, thank you, because that is significant. The fact, and I'm gonna incorporate what you're saying. Hopefully I will just be able to add a little spice as well. But that's certainly something that Joseph offers a path forward. And whenever there's such a crisis, and you can offer a path forward, it's people will listen. I was listening to an interview yesterday with a person who was, for many years, was a pilot in the Israeli Air Force. And the interviewer said, tell me one thing you learned in the Air Force, just one thing. What's one thing? And he says, you have to make a decision and you have to act forcefully. And usually, even if it's the wrong decision, you're better off choosing something and doing it forcefully than hesitating and trying to figure out what to do and analyzing too much, because if you analyze too much, you're going to be you're going to be hit down. So the point of the matter is, when somebody comes forth and someone says, this is what we're going to do, let's do it. There is some way that generates some enthusiasm, and that generates other people to follow. So that's Jill's point. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I had a question. The novelty of interpretation of Joseph is in a way that he's comparing the animals to years, something like, combining like time and space, time and matter. So that was the novelty at that time, because of the level of abstract thinking. Even if those interpreters, their spirituality wasn't on that same level. And then we also read Rashi that Pharaoh, it didn't speak to Pharaoh. Does it mean that Pharaoh's level of abstract thinking was higher? That's why he liked the interpretation of Joseph more, because he can relate to that better?
Yeah, Egypt was a sophisticated society at the time. So I don't know what they knew and what they didn't know, but they certainly had some of the things that they knew with the technology they had is absolutely astounding, how they can figure out what they knew. Certain things about astrology, certain things about all kinds of sciences. So Pharaoh was certainly sophisticated. He wasn't a kid that was just, you could just sway him by saying something, just sway him quickly. And Pharaoh, again, he's surrounded by smart people. He's got, the verse says they called all the wise men of Egypt. So Vicky is onto something very big. You're saying Joseph's idea is that in a dream, an object could represent a unit of time. And therefore, Joseph's idea is when you have 7 years, 7 objects would be 7 years. If you look at the dream interpreters of Pharaoh, they look at 7 cows or 7 ears of grain. And what do they say? They say, 7 daughters will be born, 7 daughters will die. That's only one interpretation that Rashi offers. If you look at the Medrash over there, the Medrash will say that there's all kinds of, not just the rabbis debate, by the way, also dream interpreters debate. So other dream interpreters said, you're going to conquer 7 cities, and 7 cities are going to rebel against you. Okay? So you see that consistently, the interpreters of Pharaoh are looking to interpret objects as objects for objects. In other words, the cow in the dream or the ear of grain in the dream is either a child or a city or whatever it is. And Vicky is right that Joseph comes and says, no, an object could be a unit of time. And Vicky says, well, that maybe that's time and space interrelated. Maybe Joseph has the insight of what is actually embedded in the Hebrew language. In the Hebrew language, the word for olam, the word for world, which is the globe, the world, space, is the same word. It could be used in same word could be used in other contexts for a unit of time, where you'd say ad olam means forever. So the same word olam can be all of space and all of time. So in Jewish culture, time and space was always connected, and maybe Joseph understands this. So Vicky,
Pharaoh understands that too, because that's the native.
Pharaoh understands. But he says the brilliance. He says the brilliance. Now, I just want to tie in. I'm gonna take off where Vicky left off, and I'm going to try to show how it's so. 2 points. I'm going to try to show why there's resistance. So Vicky's taking the scientific approach. Time and space are not related, so an object doesn't mean time. I'm going to try to talk about how come not only they didn't think of it, but they would be resistant to say that an object is a unit of time. They would not want to do so. And then I also want to talk about how Joseph figures out that an object could be a unit of time. So we're going to spend a little bit of time with that, and then we're going to get to the more spiritual interpretation, and hopefully that will be applicable to our life as well. So thank you for that. Go ahead, Dr. Ken. We can't hear you, but I see your hand is up. So if you have anything to share, we would love to hear.
Why, thank you. Just a quick question. The word necromancer seems very curious instead of wizard or magician. What's the word in Hebrew?
Chartumim. I'm not sure I would know the exact translation of chartumim. Chartumim to me sounds like, I don't know. It's almost like the magicians. In other words, in Egypt, seems to me that you have people that are invested in the things that are beyond, in other words, in the mystical, things that are beyond the physical senses. And they also do magic, and they also engage in dream interpretation. And I guess that it covers multiple areas, all in the realm of what is more mystical and what is less, what is not, what the naked eye cannot see. But the exact meaning of the word Khartoumim, I don't know.
Well, at least you're honest. Thanks, Rabbi.
I gave you the right answer, right? The right answer is I don't know. You can't.
Yeah, it's just curious. Why didn't they whoever translated this, why didn't they just say magicians or wizards or wise men?
Yeah,
That
I
was-
don't. This I don't know. But it does say also it does say wise men because in the verse there's two. If you look at the verse, you're going to see two descriptions.
Mm,
At the verse, I'm going to just share it right here. Verse 1. Who did he call? Here, verse 8. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called all the necromancers of Egypt and all its sages. Meha is sages as wise people, right? So he's getting everybody he can. He's getting everybody he can.
Hmm.
So that is that. So let's elaborate a little bit. Let's elaborate a little bit about what Vicky says. Vicky says Joseph's big innovation is that there's that an object could be a unit of time. Okay. I'm going to say even more than that. Joseph's also big innovation is Joseph also tells Pharaoh, not just we're talking about 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty, but Joseph also has the courage to do something that no dream interpreter will ever do. Because if he's wrong, it could be exposed. Joseph says, the 7 years of plenty are starting from this moment. In other words, the clock is ticking right now. I'll show you where he says that, but he says that. And because he says that, not only is he saying that we're talking about units of time, but he's saying he's putting his reputation on the line, right? If I tell you, by the way, I think the stock market is going to correct. Okay, fine. That everyone says that, there's no big deal. Or if I say it will go up, it doesn't matter what I say, right? If I knew the timing, I would be a billionaire, right? But I don't know the timing. It's all about a question of timing. So all the interpreters are very easy to say, oh, you can have 7 daughters are going to be born. 7 daughters are going to die. When? What time are they going to die? Nobody would say. Why would I say? That could be proven wrong. So by definition, in the dream interpreting business, you never put a time frame on your interpretation. You have to be crazy to do so. Okay. What does Joseph say? Joseph says 7 and 7. There'll be 7 years and 7 years. And then Joseph says, you know why you saw the dream twice? Because God is hastening to do it. In other words, this is not delayed. This is happening immediately, right? That's what he says. 32. And concerning the repetition of the dream to Pharaoh twice, that is because the matter is ready to emanate from God, and God is hastening to execute it. Okay? So if you're Pharaoh, and you for years, every dream interpreter comes and tells you what they say in Yiddish, they hack you in Chinik. They bang on the kettle. In other words, they produce a lot of noise. I used to think Chinik is Yiddish, and then I found out Chinik is Russian. I'm sorry. I apologize to the Russian people. We stole the phrase. It's a very good phrase. But here you have for many years, they're hacking and Chinik. They're all offering interpretations, and all interpretations are wonderful. It's like all the economists that offer interpretations. You can never prove them wrong because what do they say? They say it's going to go. The economy will go up. The economy will go down. Everybody's right. Of course, you're right. But I can't do anything with your information because you're not giving me a time. Okay. Joseph says 7 years, 7 years. I'm telling you when to invest. I'm telling you when to buy grain. I'm telling you when to sell grain. And I'm also telling you when we're starting right now. Pharaoh says, oh my God, he never heard anything like this. And he says, you're in, here are the keys, right? You know when the crash is happening, here you run the stock portfolio. That is essentially what happened here. So it's a great courage from Joseph's side. Okay. Let's go back a little bit. Last week's Parsha, we read in great detail about the two Pharaoh's ministers who were in prison with Joseph and how they had dreams, and Joseph interpreted their dreams. Now, if you look at just to advance the plot, the dreams of Pharaoh's ministers are irrelevant. It doesn't really matter what the interpretation was. Could have just said, Joseph interpreted the dreams. Pharaoh's interpretation, Pharaoh's dreams are very important to the plot, because part of the plot is that there's going to be a famine. And because of the famine, Joseph's brothers have no choice. Joseph's family, Jacob and the brothers, have no choice but to go to Egypt to buy bread. Otherwise, they would not come to Egypt. So Pharaoh's dream, not only the fact that Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, but Pharaoh's dream is critical to the plot. But the two dreams of Pharaoh's interpreters seemingly is totally irrelevant to the plot. You could have saved a full page in the Torah by saying, two guys had a dream, Joseph interpreted it, and whatever he said happened. Yet the Torah goes into great detail explaining the dreams of Pharaoh's interpreters. So therefore, some people say, you know why? Because Joseph would never be able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams before he interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's ministers. In other words, that was a prelude. Those two dreams that he had in last week's Parsha, which you read, you say, okay, do I really need to know every aspect of those dreams? Answer is yes, of course you need to know, because that was an indicator to Joseph about what these dreams are. And we're going to read through them quickly because it's very interesting. And of course, I'll give you the spoiler alert, Yesha Torah reading. Of course, what happens in that dream that is remarkable, and that's exactly what we were talking about here, but there's more details I want to add. But of course, in that dream, Joseph already comes up with his big innovation. In that dream, Joseph tells them, ladies and gentlemen, objects in your dream is units of time. So Joseph figured that out. Joseph tested his theory. It worked because he interpreted and it came about. And now Joseph says, I don't know what the Egyptians are talking about. I know how to interpret dreams. And in my school, my innovative school of interpretation, an object is a unit of time. And what worked for him in last Parsha, he deploys on Pharaoh's dreams. So now we understand why last week's Parsha, we get all the details, because it's critical to understand what Joseph saw. And I'm just giving you one element, the time issue. I'm going to add one more, and then we'll try to move on because we have a lot more to cover. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I was just wondering, why did Joseph need to test it? He knew Hebrew.
No, I mean to say to test it. I mean, when I mean test it, I mean to say this innovation.
That's really the idea.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, listen, I don't know if Joseph, I don't know. When I said that, I'm just exaggerating. I mean, he saw, the bottom line is he had practice. He comes before Pharaoh. He's already tested. His theory is tested. It's not just that he knows how to interpret dreams.
He had confidence that it may.
And again, if you put your finger on this, the way you offered, and I agree that that's a very good interpretation. The way you offered, I'm not saying it's the only one. There's others which I'm going to offer in a minute. But you put forward a very good interpretation. And this Joseph's key innovation is that an object is a unit of time. That Joseph already tested in the last dream, in the two dreams of Pharaoh's ministers, because his interpretation comes true exactly the way he said it. Yes, bingo, an object is a unit of time, which is heresy. If you go to dream interpretation school, the first rule they tell you is run away from time. Don't talk about time. You're going to be disproved every single time, right? So what Joseph is doing is not just original. It's the opposite of what they teach in Egypt. And Joseph says, no, object is unit of time. So let's go quickly. Let's read quickly the two dreams of the Pharaoh's interpreters, Pharaoh's ministers. So this is last week's Parsha. It came about after these events, after Joseph was put in prison, that the cupbearer of the king of Egypt, in other words, he was in charge of all the drinks, and the baker sinned against their master, against the king of Egypt. Pharaoh became incensed at these two chamberlains, at the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he placed them in the prison of the house of the chief of the slaughterhouses, into the prison, the place where Joseph was imprisoned. I'm skipping a little bit. They each had a dream. So Joseph says, why are you in bad moods? They said, we have a dream. We don't have any interpretation. So so Joseph says, tell me the dream. Joseph attributes it to God. He says that interpretations come from God. Tell me, maybe I can help, right? So here we go, right? So that's what Joseph says. Verse 8, and they sent to him, we have dreamt a dream, and there is no interpreter for it. Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me now. So the chief cupbearer relates his dream to Pharaoh, and he said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine is before me. And on the vine there were 3 tendrils, and it seemed to be blossoming, and its buds came out. Then its clusters ripened into grapes, and Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup on Pharaoh's palm. Wonderful dream. What does Joseph say? It's all in verse 12. Verse 12 is the big news. That's all you need to know. And Joseph said to him, this is the meaning. The 3 tendrils are 3 days. 3 branches equal 3 days. In another 3 days, Pharaoh will number you, means remember you, with the other officers, and he will restore you to your position, and you will place Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to your previous custom when you were his cupbearer. Between me and you, I could also come up with the interpretation of this cupbearer's dream. I could say, what did you dream? You dreamt that you're going to offer Pharaoh his cup. Wonderful. You're going to be reinstated to your job of offering Pharaoh drinks. That's easy. But Joseph, what Joseph's innovation is telling him it's 3 days. And we know how Joseph figured it out. Joseph figured it out. You could either say divine inspiration, but he knew that in 3 days was a big deal. You'll see later, 3 days is Pharaoh's birthday party. At the birthday party, Pharaoh needs someone to offer drinks. So he has to go back. Who's the best drink? What do they call it? Who's the best bartender in all of Egypt? Oh, he's in prison. Oh, we got to get him out of prison, right? So Pharaoh, so he knows. So Joseph knows. Then Joseph says, "Please remember me and mention me to Pharaoh," which the guy does not. But in any case, verse 16. Now the chief baker saw that he interpreted well, so he said to Joseph, "Me too in my dream. Behold, there were 3 wicker baskets on my head, and in the topmost basket were all kinds of Pharaoh's food, the work of a baker, and the birds were eating them from the basket atop my head." And Joseph replied and said, "This is the meaning. The 3 baskets represent three days." Again, the first thing he says. Later on, you see he has bad news for the guy. The birds are eating not the bread. The birds are eating your flesh. You're going to be dead. But his big innovation, what he starts with, he says, yes, of course, 3 baskets equals 3 days. In another 3 days, Pharaoh will remove your head from you and hang you on the gallows, and the birds will eat your flesh off you. Whoa. Right? The other guy got a good interpretation. So the cupbearer got a good interpretation. So the baker also offered an interpretation. But lo and behold, he didn't get the same interpretation. How did Joseph figure this out from the dream is another story. We don't have time for that. But what I'm trying to say is, in both dreams, Joseph says, 3 branches are 3 days. 3 baskets are 3 days. And then he says, that happened 3 days later. Now it came about on the 3rd day, Pharaoh's birthday. Okay, my suspicion is that Joseph knows when Pharaoh's birthday is. If you live in a monarchy, everyone knows when Pharaoh's birthday is. Pharaoh's birthday is a national holiday, right? So I think that it's also, of course, divine inspiration, but for even on a logical perspective, Joseph could think and say, 3 days, Pharaoh's birthday, Pharaoh has to make a party, he has to think about his ministers. He figures it out. I'm not saying it was just logic or just divine interpretation, but I'm saying that's the plan. I'm just saying Joseph is on to this. Joseph got his big idea. Object equals time. Okay, fine. I want to say one more thing about those 2 dreams and how they impact Joseph's dreams. And then I want to give one more spiritual interpretation, and then we'll see what the clock tells us. Because we too are subject to time to some degree. Okay, I'm going to give you another interpretation. So that was Vicky's innovation. Vicky's innovation is that Joseph's innovation was that an object equals a unit of time. By the way, don't go anywhere before we explain how this applies in the spiritual soul. But for that, we have to add a dimension. Okay. Another interpretation comes from that Barbanel. Barbanel, great commentator, 16th century commentator. He was the minister of the king and queen of France when they were in Spain, the finance minister when the Jews were expelled from Spain. And he was a prolific writer and very innovative. And Abarbanel reads the story and he says, what's going on here? Why can't anybody else figure out the interpretation? And I'll tell you what Abarbanel says, and then I'm going to give you a little twist where modern commentators try to twist it a little bit, which either take it or leave it, whatever you want. But what Abarbanel says, he says like this. He says, when you go to school, when you enroll in dream interpretation school, first semester, what's the first thing they tell you? I already told you the first law. The first law is run away from time. But what's the second law? The second law is that everything in a dream is a metaphor. When you'll see an object, it's never the interpretation is never what you saw, because dreams are mysterious and dreams are imaginative, and the imagination goes wild. So there's no clarity in a dream. So whatever you see in a dream is a metaphor for something else. If that's the premise, so if you dreamt about 7 ears of grain, the first thing that any first year dream interpreter knows is, I don't know what the interpretation is, but I know it's not about grain. It's not about the Nile giving forth produce because the fat cow is eating at the bank of the Nile. It can't be that. Why? Because the premise is that the metaphor, it has to be a metaphor for something else. Everything is a metaphor in the dream. Pharaoh's dream, there was clarity. It was so clear, the interpretation was so clear, and that's why they couldn't figure it out, because they figured this must be a metaphor for something else. So the ears of grain must be cities, the ears of grain must be daughters. Can't be grain, because the dream speaks in metaphors. That was the premise. That was the premise of the Abarbanel. That's the way Abarbanel explains the premise of the Pharaoh's ministers. Now, Abarbanel says, if I'm not mistaken, Joseph has an innovation, and Joseph understands that no, some dreams come from God, and he sensed that this is God giving Pharaoh. This is God giving Pharaoh insight, and therefore this is not a classic dream, which is a metaphor. Pharaoh's being spoon-fed the interpretation, and Joseph was smart enough to figure that out. How we figured it out, I don't know. God's help. That's what Abarbanel says. I just want to point out how some modern people try to twist this, how to tweak this a little bit. Let's go back to last parsha. Last dreams, the same thing happens. If you look at the dream of the cupbearer, what's the dream? The dream is that he's squeezing a grape and giving it to the Pharaoh. What do you see in that dream? In that dream, there are no metaphors. In that dream, whatever the minister, the cupbearer saw, that's what came about. So when Joseph understands, last dream, Joseph already understood that some dreams could be not a metaphor, but an interpretation, but the dream itself gives you the interpretation. So now Joseph uses that same skill when it comes to Pharaoh. And he's not afraid to say that you saw not a metaphor, but you saw what's actually going to happen. That's what, so far we have that Abarbanel, we have what modern people say, and now I'm going to say what I think. I'm saying, just to add a little bit of Abarbanel. I don't like to say what I think, but here I'm going to say what I think. With Pharaoh's dream, it's very interesting. Pharaoh's dream, the first dream is about cows, the second dream is about ears of grain. So it could be that what Joseph figured out is Pharaoh was shown both. He was shown the dream. The dream is the cows. Cows as a symbol of plenty of grain. But he didn't see the grain, he saw the cows. And that followed the pattern of dreams, which is the object is a metaphor. But then he was shown a second dream, and in the second dream, Hashem showed him the interpretation, which is the ears of grain. So in that sense, what Joseph figures out is that Pharaoh was showing him both, that God is showing Pharaoh both the interpretation and the dream. And just going back to last parsha, again, I don't know if this is right or wrong. If you look back at last parsha, it's very interesting that the dream of the baker was a metaphor. The dream of the cupbearer was not a metaphor, right? If you look back, and you will see that the dream of the baker was that the birds are eating the baked goods from the basket. Now, did that happen literally? No, that was a metaphor. The birds are not eating the baked goods. Joseph said the birds are going to eat your flesh because Pharaoh's going to hang you, and the birds are going to eat your flesh. So in that dream, Joseph is able to decipher that some dreams are a metaphor and some dreams are not. And with that history, he comes to Pharaoh. So what do we have so far? We spent 45 minutes and we had basically two big ideas of what failed everybody else, and what failed everybody else, all the other interpreters, and Joseph's innovation. The first, give me just a second, I'm just going to summarize, then we'll take questions, and then we'll give the last interpretation, and then we'll apply it to our life, and then we'll figure out what to do. But again, just to summarize, the first big idea was that what what made all the other interpreters drop the ball and miss the point is that they were looking for objects as a symbol for objects. And Joseph understands that an object in a dream could be a symbol for a unit of time. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is when the dream interpreter sees, when the other dream interpreter sees an object, they say this is a metaphor for something else. So they were misled because this dream was not a metaphor for something else. This dream was, in fact, the interpretation itself. So these are the two sort of general ways of reading the story. I'm about to give a third, which won't take as long, I hope. And the third also has a spiritual side to it. So let's take a question and then we continue. Go ahead.
Is it significant that it went from animals to plants, like from the animal world to plant world?
Yeah, that's a side point. I don't know if it's a side point or not, but the Rebbe has an interpretation that Pharaoh, contrast that to Joseph's dreams. Joseph's dreams, you begin with, if you go back to, there's so many dreams here. In the beginning of last week's parsha, Joseph has dreams. And what's Joseph's dreams? Joseph's dreams are, the first one is he has sheaves of grain bowing to him. And the next one, it's the stars and the sun and the moon. So you're basically going from earthly to heavenly. So you're going upward. With Pharaoh's dreams, the reverse happens. You're starting with animals, which animal is a higher form of life than vegetation. And then you go back and the second dream is vegetation. So, so you're going downward, And Pharaoh is this opposite of Joseph. Joseph, actually the Hebrew word for Joseph means to increase. When Rachel has Joseph, she names him Joseph, she says God should add another child. Joseph is always growing. But Pharaoh is a symbol of Egypt, and Egypt is a symbol of narcissism. And narcissism, the more self-centered the person becomes, the more lower he falls. So you go from higher forms of life to lower forms of life. So that's true, but I'm not sure this gives us insight in why the other dream interpreters missed it. Okay, how does this all apply to our life? It's a very good question, because it's very nice to know why the dream interpreters missed the point, but I'm not a dream interpreter. So why do I need to know this? So I'm going to try to add the Rebbe's commentary on the story. And once you get to the Rebbe's commentary, this unlocks an entire world of inspiration and significance and applicability. So here we go. So the Rebbe's innovation is as follows. Let's find the verse so we see, and you don't have to take my word for it, because I'd rather you save your blind faith on something else. Don't have to believe what I say. I'm going to try to show it to you inside. This is last week's Parsha. How are we going to find Miketz? Okay. Okay, the Rebbe says like this. I think I said this in the past, but it's so brilliant. It's actually, I love this interpretation. So here we go. What misled the people, the Pharaoh's interpreters, and what Joseph was able to interpret according to the Rebbe's interpretation. The Rebbe's interpretation actually ties into many points that we already said. What Jill said and what Vicky said, it all ties in, but it's an innovative approach. What's the problem with the verse? What's the problem with the dreams that misled everybody else? Assuming the dreams of Pharaoh interpreters understand that, yes, 7 healthy cows and 7 bad cows could be 7 good years and bad years. What's the problem? Why couldn't they say that? So another interpretation is the problem lies in verse 3. And behold, 7 other cows were coming up after them from the Nile, of ugly appearance and lean of flesh. And they stood beside the cows which were on the Nile bank. Verse 4, and the cows of ugly appearance and lean flesh devoured the 7 cows. When did that happen? I don't know. But I know, I'm highlighting these words, and they stood beside the cows which were on the Nile bank. Now, if the dreams were that there's 7 fat cows emerged from the Nile, and they're beside, and they're grazing next to the Nile. And then you have 7 ugly cows and devoured lean of flesh emerge from the Nile and immediately devour the 7 fat cows. Then I could say that it's 7 years following 7 years, because first you have 7 years of plenty, and then you have 7 years of famine. The problem was the end of verse 3. The end of verse 3, for some period of time, there were 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows standing next to each other, doing nothing, twiddling their thumbs, or checking their email, or doing anything else cows do. That was the problem. Say the other interpreters, it's impossible to say that this is 7 years following 7 years. Because if that's the case, those years do not line up simultaneously. The years of famine follow the years of plenty, but they're not there together. That's why they say it cannot be years. That's why they say, says the Rebbe, that it has to be, let's say, children. Because you know something? With children, it's actually an interesting metaphor. If you have enough wives, you could have children be born and children die simultaneously. And at the same time, you'll have mourning and you will have rejoicing. You'll have the fat cows and the skinny cows together. So that's the big obstacle to say that it's time. Not what I said earlier, but the idea of what is the meaning of the dream that they stood together. That's what causes all other interpreters to not be able to say that it's 7 years following 7 years. Because here you have 14 cows standing next to each other. It cannot be 7 years plus 7 years. And here is Joseph's innovation. And this is Jill's, and this ties into what Jill said. What Joseph is telling Pharaoh is that God is not only telling you the problem, that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and 7 years of famine that follow. But God is actually telling you what the solution should be and what your action should be. And therefore, I asked earlier, who asked Joseph to give a solution, to give advice of what to do? Because he tells Pharaoh, now you should collect the grain in the years of plenty and save it for the years of famine. Nobody asked Joseph what to do. We just asked Joseph to interpret the dream. So why is Joseph running to tell Pharaoh what to do? The answer is because Joseph is not telling Pharaoh what to do. Joseph is giving Pharaoh the interpretation of the dream. He's telling Pharaoh that within the dream, you have the interpretation of the dream. Where is that? When you have the fat cows standing next to the skinny cows, God is telling you that make sure that you're living in both those planes together, that you combine the years of plenty and the years of famine, you have that together. How so? Because in the years of plenty, you're saving grain for the years of famine. So in the first 7 years, you're not just living in a state of plenty, but you're also collecting for the years of famine. So you have both simultaneously. And in the years of famine, you sustain yourself from the grain of the years of plenty. So in some sense, you always have both years together, because in the years of plenty, you're storing for the years of famine. And in the years of famine, you're storing for the years of plenty. So Jill said that Pharaoh was very impressed that Joseph has a solution. But that's true. But what the Rebbe adds to that interpretation is Pharaoh is impressed, not just that Joseph has a solution, but the dream itself has a solution. And this is what the Rebbe says so far. What I'm going to add is like this. What I'm going to add is that in Egyptian culture, they believe that everything is determined by the gods. It's pagan society. All you have to do is please the gods, but the human intervention does not have much power. And if the gods want to destroy you, they will. And if the gods want to bring years of famine, they will. And if they want to destroy your economy, they will destroy your economy. You really cannot do much. And here is Joseph's innovation. Joseph's innovation is that no, God is telling you that there's a negative circumstances, but God in the dream is telling you a solution how to solve it. In other words, God is not just creating a reality that is determined, that is going to bring the destruction and calamity. But God says there's going to be a challenge, but God empowers the people to solve this problem. And that's something that was totally new and totally innovative to Joseph, to Pharaoh. Now, what is the lesson to us? So there are many lessons to us. We could talk about this for a while, but let's just say very general. What very general is, we like to look at the world and we like to see there are 7 years, there's good and there's bad, there's positive and negative in all areas of life. There's positive and there's negative. There's 7 good years, there's 7 bad years. There's circumstances which are blessed and there are circumstances which are challenging. And when we're in the circumstances that are challenging, we feel that we have no way forward. What Joseph is telling us is that in reality, there's always, like the dream tells you, there's always a mix of opportunity and challenge. In the 7 years of plenty, there's also, you have to prepare for the years of famine. But in the years of famine, you could live off the years of plenty. In other words, God, when God sends you a challenge, he's not sending you a challenge and telling you, this is the challenge and it's just supposed to be bad. And that's what I want. I want it to be famine. So I want it to be challenging your life. And there's nothing you can do about it. If you look carefully and you adapt Joseph's perspective of how to interpret dreams, you will see that you have the fat cows and the skinny cows together. In other words, within the problem, God is already putting the seeds of how to transform the negative to the positive, which is what happens, because you now could make the years of famine and you could sustain yourself because you now have part of the years of plenty set aside for the years of famine. In other words, the idea that things are either good or bad is a misconception. We, in our life, have everything is a mix. There's always opportunity and challenge combined. And what we have to understand is that both parts of our life, both the good years and the bad years, are really part of one story. It's really part of one solution forward. And if we understand that and we know that, we'll be able to see that both lie hand in hand within the challenges and opportunity. And sometimes the greatest opportunity for growth lies within the challenge. And all this comes from Joseph's understanding that in the dreams, you have the fat cows and the skinny cows together, because in the negative circumstances, you have positive circumstances. Now, this has many ramifications. I'm just going to give a little bit just to play around with the Hebrew word for interpreting dreams. The Hebrew word for interpreting dreams, poter. Poter is the same letters as the word tofer, sowing. And it's also the same letters, pei resh taf. It also is the same letters for a blessing that Jacob blesses Joseph at the end of his life. At the end of Jacob's life, the father, he blesses all of the children. And he gives everybody a blessing. And Joseph, I think, gets the longest blessing, or maybe the second to longest blessing, probably the longest blessing. And Jacob refers to Joseph, he blesses him, and he gives him a compliment, and the compliment goes like this, amongst other things. Ben Porat Yosef, a charming son is Joseph. Porat he translates as Ben Chen. Yeah, Rashi says it's charming, beauty, charm. Joseph is a beautiful, charming son. We know that to be the case because we know of the history of Joseph and how beautiful he was. Okay. The Kabbalists explain that the same word for charming, porat, pei resh taf, those same 3 letters, Hebrew is a funny language. The same letters could make different roots, and words that seem totally unrelated are in fact related. So the word for charm, porat, Joseph as porat, ben porat, charming son. The word for interpretation of a dream, and the word for tofer, to sew, to thread together, to sew together, are all the same letters. What is the Kabbalistic meaning of this? What is Joseph's essential dream interpretation? What really he's doing is he's sewing together the good years and the bad years. Joseph's innovation here is that God is not telling you there's going to be good and there's going to be bad. No, the good and the bad are part of one story. God is telling you how you should relate to the circumstance and sew the good and bad together, connected to it's all part of one story moving you forward. It's not that the good years are here to bring you up and the bad years are here to destroy you. They're here together. They're all part of the growth. Even the challenging part in your life is part of growth. Even the distance from God is here just to increase your longing and desire and passion for God. In other words, it's a very Kabbalistic idea that really there's no such thing as good as dark and light, because the dark itself ultimately is part of the light. The negativity itself, its purpose is to bring you to light and to bring you closer to God and to propel you forward, and you should grow from the challenge. And in that sense, it's not that there's two parts, there's the good and the bad. It's all part of one story. So the interpretation of the dream is the threading together of the dream. And when you do that, you get to the charm. Remember, it's the same words, interpreting a dream and threading together and charming, all the same words. You'll find the charm in every situation. You'll find the beauty in every situation if you'll understand that the challenge, the negativity, the darkness is here as part of the greater story to bring you to a place of increased holiness, increased love, and increased intimacy with God. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Everybody can stick around and share thoughts and jokes and Hanukkah stories. But in any case, that's the story in short. So thank you very much for participating, and